We live and we breathe this beautiful dream. We are kings, we are queens.
I speak of the Africa.
I want to say good morning to everyone again, and it is a privilege to be asked to offer a few words to help set the context for this interfaith session today and the experience that I've had now for about the past 6 years in terms of interfaith work and dialogue in Evanston as it revolves around the whole issue of reparations and how our program began and how the interfaith movement in Evanston became really deeply and intricately involved within it. So before I do that, I want to offer just several points that I think are important regarding interfaith dialogue. And I want to talk about very briefly about 4 different points that I think are salient and relevant for every locale, for every community, for every town and city. And one of them is naming the shared moral imperative, that we have something in common no matter what our background is, no matter what our religious beliefs are. Across our diverse faith traditions, whether rooted in scripture, oral history, or ethical practice, we find a common call to repair what has been broken. Interfaith work becomes powerful when we admit that historical harms still live in our present systems: housing, education, policing, health, and wealth, to name a few. Contextualizing local reparations begins with acknowledging the truth that repair is not an optional gesture of charity, but a shared moral responsibility that is grounded in justice. So the way that came about, I think, in Evanston was through actual relationship building that occurred across faiths, that occurred across denominations under the Christian canopy. I arrived here about 10 years ago, and there are 2 organizations in Evanston that comprise all of the houses of worship. One of them is called Evanston Interfaith Clergy and Leaders. There are probably about 30 different houses of worship that are involved in that, and that includes different faith traditions as well. The other one is called Evanston Own It, and that is an African-American group of clergy that have been meeting for about 11 years now, that was started by a former alderperson, the late Dolores Holmes. So there are 2 different groups. The one group is just about all white. When I started going to that, it was all white. And then there was a Negro that appeared, and that was me. And the other one was all African American. So I was going to both of them and continue to go to both of them these 10 years later. What that did, I think, is it provided an opportunity for Evanston Interfaith Clergy and Leaders to hear the voice of somebody from the Black church experience. Not that they hadn't done that before, but I was meeting with them on a regular basis, developing friendships and relationships. When tragedies occurred at the national level, one of the things that I did when I first arrived is I decided to have community services of lament. I arrived in 2015. What happened in 2015? The massive slaying at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. I didn't know anybody, and so I had just arrived. I had just been installed a month before that tragedy occurred. So when I sent word out that we need to have a community gathering, nobody said, well, he doesn't know what he's doing, or maybe he doesn't know what he's doing, but he doesn't know how we do it. So everybody showed up, and we probably had about 800 people in our church that seats 325 people. And that was when folks began to recognize we really are capable of doing some things together, even though we have pretty dramatic differences. And as a result of that, we started having those kinds of gatherings on a regular basis. It talked about what we're talking about now in terms of shared moral imperatives. Everybody was concerned. Everybody wanted to know, what can we do to help to assist, to relieve some of the pain that was being experienced by members of Emmanuel, but to also address some of the pain and the concerns that folks were feeling right here in Evanston. So those relationships began to build, and this was 2015. 4 years later, by 2019, we have a reparations program in Evanston that is passed in November of that year. Those relationships have been built up. About 2 years later, it was the interfaith community that came together and said, we've got to do something to participate in the reparations program. It was going on, and they were supporting it, but they were supporting it pretty much like everybody else, silently, quietly. We agree with what city council has done, those sorts of things. And when they finally decided we need to do more than that, a couple of years later, they gathered together and said, we are going to raise money to assist and help with reparations in Evanston. And we thought that was a good idea. And some of us, led by Robin Simmons and a few others, started a nonprofit organization called Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston. And we did that because we felt at one point the reparations program that is being done through the city might have a new mayor and new city council people who will say, okay, we've done everything that we can. We felt like we needed to have our own organization, nonprofit, with its own African-American board, its own African-American leaders. And that group of interfaith folks then decided that they would make contributions to RSAE, Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston. So in the summer of 2021, they met and decided that they would have a big public event, made the promise that they would raise money and present it at the next Martin Luther King Jr. Interfaith service that we started when we first got here. And so 6 months later, they presented just about $1 million, 16 different congregations. And Jewish Reconstruction Center was one of them. So we thank you all for being here. Just amazing. But I want you all to know this interfaith work was developed and grounded in relationships. We had built relationships with one another. So other folks from Evanston Own It, the African-American clergy group, started going and participating in the interfaith clergy group. So we started doing work together. We started doing field trips together down into Chicago, going to the DeSable Museum one day and going to the Holocaust Museum over in Skokie the next day. We were building relationships, and those relationships continue to be built. So secondly, you want to make sure in an interfaith group that grounding reparations is always done through local stories that really help to talk about the local harm that has been done because of racism that existed. And those local stories are really, really powerful stories. If you go up to just about every single African American in Evanston that is 50 or 60 years older, they will tell you of an individual story about something that happened with regard to racism that set them back. And Dr. Carruthers talked about being born and raised here. She can talk about foster school when there was segregation in the public school system in the Evanston community. We know about redlining with regard to housing. There were so many particular issues. So whatever you do in terms of interfaith dialogue, you want to make sure that you're listening to and hearing and being receptive to the stories that are going on in your community. And then thirdly, mobilizing collective power through shared values. We sort of touched on that already. When interfaith groups are able to come together, don't doubt the power that exists. There is so much power that exists, not just as it relates to reparations, but as it relates to everything. A few years ago, we were having trouble trying to pass a city budget. And then the city manager decided, well, we're going to have to cut 6 or 7 social programs that have been aimed specifically to support the black community. So what did we do? The interfaith community got together and said, no, you ain't gonna do that. That's not gonna happen. You're not gonna balance the budget on the backs of those who can least afford to have those programs taken away. So we met over 2 or 3 weeks with city council at their city council meetings, and we flooded the city council session. We did. We had hundreds of people there. They were outside of the city council meeting room. They were outside of City Hall at the time. And they let the city manager and everybody else, the mayor and members of the city council, know you cannot balance this budget in that way. And that was done through the interfaith movement. And finally, the fourth thing that I want to share is moving from symbolic solidarity to material repair. It is so easy to get caught up in just being symbolic, you all. It is so easy in saying, oh my goodness, look at what we have, look at what we're doing, look at what we're accomplishing. It is easy for us to pat ourselves on our backs and to pat each other on the back and say, you know, wasn't it wonderful that we went to this program? Or wasn't it wonderful that we went to this symposium, right? You know, this is our 5th symposium. It takes more than symbolism. It takes rolling up your shirt sleeves, going back to your communities and going back to your houses of worship and saying, come hell or high water, we have got to work together. We have got to set aside any of our theological differences. We have got to set aside any of our scriptural differences, any of our doctrinal differences, because the cause is greater. There is an urgency that is in the air. The NAACP's motto for this year was the fierce urgency of now. Dr. Mays said it best when he said, I only have a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, didn't choose it. I must suffer if I lose it, give account if I abuse it. Only a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. And we say all the time here in Evanston, we may not have it all together, but together we have it all. And that's what Interfaith movement is all about. And when we have our other folks from our group this morning come together, we're going to wrap our thinking and our focus around the importance of engaging in interfaith dialogue in your communities. Let me lastly say, as I fork it back over to Dr. Carruthers, that since 2019, I have visited about 15 different communities throughout the United States, as diverse as Roanoke, Virginia, to Palm Springs, California. And I have been invited by interfaith groups in each of those communities to talk about the interfaith work that we have done here. And in a lot of those communities, they have actually begun interfaith reparations work that is really reaping great dividends, especially in Palm Springs. So keep in mind that you have the impetus to make a tremendous change in your community. You can be the instrument of change. You can be the voice of change. Don't always expect the preacher to do it. Amen. Let me say that one more time. Don't always expect the preacher to do it. As well as intended as many preachers may be, they receive 100 things on their desk, and this idea of reparations may just be one of 100. So you have to take the banner up yourself and be that effective change in your community. And I guarantee you what we've done in Evanston is not because Evanston is so special, but it is filled with people who are special, just like those in your own community. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Dr. Nabors was right on time. We each had 12 minutes. He did it at 12 minutes and 2 seconds. And was that not powerful? And of course, the takeaway of being relational is so foundational to it. I am here to add to this conversation with an effort to make some commonality around our theological reflection. And I want to do that in a couple of ways. One, I want to reiterate the situational analysis that we are in fact living. Then I want to raise some questions about a theological framework that gives us a way to think about what we do both in terms of ideation and then what we do on the street. And finally, I think we would be remiss if we did not look at the question of AI and its implications for how we are mobilizing and how we are thinking about fundamentally what it means to be human. And with that, then close us out with some thoughts about where do we go from here. As I said, we only have 12 minutes. That's harder to do than being given an hour to speak somewhere, right? So let me just begin by first situating this moment in time experientially, especially given the transgenerational lack of knowledge continuity that some of us must take responsibility for having not passed down the stories necessary for each generation to build upon the other. But this Trumpism did not come out of the sky. It is grounded in a 50-year history and projection that is largely related to the projected demographic shifts in terms of the browning of America. And so it was literally 50 years ago in which those who gave us behavioralism then said we were going to, in fact, no longer deal with behavioralism, but move towards what was called a genetic meritocracy. Very, very important for us to understand that. And number two, for us to understand that built upon that genetic meritocracy was also this notion that democracy was obsolete, that we were going to be in a point in which the browning of America was going to change who controlled America unless there was intervention. So by the turn of the century that we are presently in, 6 heirs, to put it in perspective, 6 heirs of the Walton Walmart family had the wealth of 600 million people in the world, in the global south. 6 people, 600 million in the global south. And so it was clear that there was a collision course that was getting ready to happen, and that collision course was rooted in white dominion. I challenge myself not to use white supremacy, but white dominion, and I make that distinction, which takes me then to this theological reflection I would like for us from our various traditions to consider, that the story is not told fully. The story is often told as a narrative of justice. I think we have to situate justice in tandem with righteousness. One speaks to individual outcomes, the other speaks to the communal outcome that is grounded in a sense of community ethos. And when we peel those layers back, we see that Western theology, we see that the ways in which those who would put greed and money and materialism ahead of spirit and doing the right thing, we see that they have conveniently either conflated justice and righteousness, or they have, in fact, ignored righteousness altogether. So we can go back to Old Testament and we can see in which the text really clearly begins to make us see the distinction, and a distinction in the sense that there is individual standards for justice and there is communal standards for justice. But we can go back even further than that, which I think speaks to the more foundational question, which is the banning of the African narrative out of the religions that followed it. And so if you go back to the concept of ma'at in terms of Kemetic spirituality, you will see that righteousness and justice and truth were inseparable. And that is the point I want us to consider. What does it mean for us in our ideation and work as thought leaders in relationship to reparations and reparatory justice? What does that mean if we were to understand the significance of truth, righteousness, and justice? And that takes me, therefore, to the act of remembrance, sacred memory, as a function of righteousness. And when we begin to think about sacred memory, it forces us to understand that we are obligated to then tell the story. That's what Reverend Nabors just told us. We must tell the story. We must be listeners. And when we do that, we center the community. We center a pedagogy that says the community narrative from the ground up, those whose backs are against the wall, must inform ultimately how we measure outcome, measure impact. All those words they use now when you all got to write a grant. You know what I'm talking about, right? So it is this notion of centering the community well-being. And in Africa, very often communities begin the day with not saying, how are you, but how are the children? that takes you to a whole nother understanding about what you are doing when you ask yourself, how are the children in relationship to what you are doing? So in the context of socialization then, it brings me to my second point, and I like to use, lifting up from my tradition, the sacred text of what I call the O and the Z. When you look at Onesimus' story on the pathway to reconciliation versus Zacchaeus, I think you see a totally different outcome. Onesimus was one who found himself enslaved, quote unquote, went away and came back in the posture of reconciliation, but in coming back in that posture of reconciliation, it was one in which he was going to be more adapted to a system that did not change. A system that did not change. So he left a system that oppressed him and came back to a reiterated system that had not changed of oppression. So he was better off in the sense that he knew how to adjust to the new system. That's where we are right now in terms of this situational analysis. We are in a moment in which the system is being readjusted, but not towards justice and righteousness, but towards the interests of those who are already in control, trying to figure out how they stay in control. Now, on the other hand, the Zacchaeus story is a much more appropriate story and narrative for us to use as it relates to how we measure the impact of reparatory justice. And in that narrative, again, a narrative that, quote, is taking us back to reconciliation, is a narrative that says those who have done the harm must adjudicate that harm in ways that allow them to, one, acknowledge, apologize, show contrition, covenant not to do it again, and make restitution. That's an entirely different model that leads you to where we are if we really want to go back to a state of being in divine synergy with the interest and the will of the divine for justice and liberation and righteousness. And so I think as we move beyond our individual initiatives as it relates to having entered into the context of our communities with this demand for reparations, which I consider to be a sacred demand, that's a footnote, then it is important that we think about what is the North Star. Where are we really trying to go? Are we trying to go back to the Onesimus story, or are we really embracing the Zacchaeus story? And the Zacchaeus story is really what gives Evanston its uniqueness. As I said, I was here, I grew up here, and so I saw how Evanston handled the historic moment and opportunity around, quote, the post-1954 Supreme Court decision on desegregation of schools. So this is not the first rodeo for Evanston in terms of being a historic community. But this notion of reparations was born out of a Zacchaeus model. It was a model of taking dollars that were related to tax equity and redistributing them in a manner that would force apology, would force retrition, would force reflection, would force the kind of collaboration that Dr. Nabors has given us. And that makes it very different and important. So now we're turning the corner on this 250th year commemoration of fake democracy, if you want to say that, and I do. And the question then becomes, in this moment of AI, where do we go from here? So AI has completely conflated truth versus reality, the fake versus the real. And we understand the consequences of that. Younger people who's not only having to confront what this technology is doing to their brain development, but also the content of the messages they are getting. And as it relates to that, if you look at the data and the research underneath AI, we are going to find, as ethicists and as faith leaders, a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human? What is the divine understanding of the creation? And how does this notion of relationships, who is worthy, who is human, who is not going to be impacted by this new technology and technocracy which is reshaping our lives? And so for me, I want to suggest that our work requires us to think more deeply about what it means to be human, as we now have to embrace what the researchers and scientists call singularity. Singularity meaning the convergence of this technology that is on the outside with our notion of the technology and the emotional system that is on the inside, and all of that bundled up in an understanding of what it means to be spiritual. So if we don't begin to look at that notion of biological spirituality and non-biological spirituality, they call it an eco-brain. We are all going to have, in singularity, another kind of brain outside of ourselves. And the question is, who is going to control it? And when we look at in whose hands the technology is, we ought to be real worried. So we cannot afford to be silent. So the last part of my presentation that I wanted to deposit here is the part of us weaving this cloth and this narrative, this story, getting the best of all of our gifts on the table in the room with a set of questions that allow us to enter into a new place, a new space, a new opportunity for transformative leadership as faith leaders. And those questions really have to do with how do we effect justice and righteousness in an age of what I call the metanomic. The metanomic being where the world has been transformed by the convergence of the metaverse and genetic sciences. Very, very important, because now it is no longer about what is in our heart, and not just our heart, but also what is in our mind. And when the world adopts the notion that it is all about the intelligence of the mind, it is all about the material well-being, i.e. wealth, then we may have the knowledge and the ideas, but we don't have the wisdom to have the covenant with the Creator. And that's what we need to think more deeply about. And so I just want us to consider this construct of Ubuntu, the South African notion that I am because you are, namaste, that I see you, sawubona, I see you, I feel you, I hear you. The questions of how are the children. I want us to think about the fact that 42% of youth in the world under the age of 35 by 2030 will reside in Africa. So what does that mean then for our understanding of what it means to be human in terms of the notion of Sankofa? Go back and fetch it. Go back and fetch that which will lead to the prosperity and well-being of humankind and not to the destruction of it. Thank you. Oh, I forgot I'm supposed to be facilitator. And so our next person, our next person is, I think, Reverend Derrick Rice.
Greetings, family. I am bothered because Dr. Carruthers asked me to follow her, and she had to, excuse my French, but she had the nerve to tell me, you can do it from off the top of your head. And I'm thinking, no, I cannot do that. You do that. But I want to let you all know, my name is Rev.Dr. Derrick Rice. I am the executive director, executive assistant to the president and strategic partnerships specialist at McCormick Seminary under the leadership of Rev.Dr. Maisha K. Handy. And I want to bring you greetings on her behalf, where this crucial work is actually being advanced by the Center of Reparatory Justice under the leadership of Dr. Mama Iva Carruthers. My task this morning is to trace the historical continuity of the harm that necessitates reparations and then to connect the dots to people of African descent and religious diversity. That history in my mind presents as an unbroken chain that is fueled by a profound ethical crisis that has perpetually attacked our existence since our beginning. That crisis, I believe, above all, requires a spiritual solution. I'm thankful that the ancestors, as I prepared Mama Iva, led me to consider Mama Marimba Ani's first book, when then as Donna Richards, she wrote, "Let the circle be unbroken." That was a mandate validating the spiritual and cultural continuities that survived the Ma'afa that I believe are necessary as we connect the dots of religious diversity in this fight for reparations. I want to begin by reiterating the point that Mama Iva has made for years on this topic, where she pushes us to realize that we would do well to view reparations as a process versus as a destination. Most of us can see, talk, and think about reparations in political and legal and economic terms. Many of us know that the Ma'afa was declared a crime against humanity in Durban in 2001. We know that it was informed by the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946 that defined and codified crimes against humanity when they listed core acts like murder and enslavement and other inhumane acts that provide legal precedent for us to do this work. We understand the economic debt built by institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase and Citizens Bank that took enslaved Africans as collateral for loans, and Aetna and CVS Health and New York Life, who have made billions of unjust enrichment on stolen lives and stolen labor. But the spiritual nature of this reparations mandate remains critical. And as a process of remembering, repairing, restoring, and reconciling, and the requisite steps of atonement, reckoning, and transformation, we ought land at a clear understanding about both the harm that has been done to us, but more importantly, the harm that we've done to ourselves. Talking about reparations in the context of faith and spirituality can sometimes be a very slippery slope. Largely because when you talk about moral restoration as a journey from repentance to confession and reconciliation that even pushes us towards salvation, those ideas feel good to most good believers, no matter what you call God. And so there's a comfort in talking about repentance, and there's a comfort in talking about reconciliation, but not so much comfort when being about it becomes what's called for us to do the work. When they have to consider their own behavior and the ways that they have directly benefited from the crimes that were committed, it's a different story. They much rather skip the front end hard work and rush to talk about reconciliation, but we need to remember that this is a process. And this journey of repair pushes us to ask the most fundamental question that is required of any theology. What precisely is it that has been broken? And it's not merely an economic issue. The crisis is much deeper. This crisis is about broken covenants. And the continuity of harm is sustained by two intersecting crises: systemic violations, yes, and self-betrayal. We recognize that systemic violations are what birthed this nation's global power, a systemic campaign that meets the legal definition of genocide and crimes against humanity. But despite those realities, somehow our ancestors found a way to keep the covenant that they made with God and their ancestors when they came here. They kept the covenant by creating self-determined communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood and Eatonville, Florida, and New Philadelphia, Illinois, Mound Bayou, Mississippi, and others. And all of those were met with swift, violent responses from the empire. The covenant was broken, but they kept their covenant. Those ancestors taught us that any enemy of our liberation is an enemy of our covenant that we made with God before we came here. The covenant that reminds us, for some who might be thinking, that oppression is not our destiny, but we have broken the covenant ourselves. Some of us have broken the connection to our people and the consciousness of our purpose that we came here with due to the internalized disruption of the covenant. The Zacchaeus text that Mama Iva mentioned, I thought was interesting because Jesus intentionally calls Zacchaeus, who's pimping his people and financing his own oppression at the same time, but Jesus yet calls him son of Abraham. And I believe he's reminding him that there's an ancestral connection that he needs to remember as he moves through the work that he thinks God called him to. Who he is an African spiritual covenant that he had broken. But this disruption speaks to what Resmaa Menakem called white body supremacy, a cultural operating system sustained through transgenerational transmissions of trauma, the wordless stories of threat that are baked into the design of oppressive institutions that many of us believe we can use as tools towards our freedom. Reparations obviously has to do with what these institutions and America owes us, but it has much more in my mind to do with what we owe ourselves. We cannot expect anyone else to give us what they owe us until we renew our own covenant with God and our ancestors. Too many of us move like, in my opinion, we are addicted to oppression. And I believe that God might be leading us the long way around the wilderness to give us some time to get our minds. When oppression acts as a gatekeeper to our liberation, the very agents of repair become complicit in perpetuating the harm that is done on us. We cannot expect to dismantle the external manifestation of what Mama Marimba Ani called Yurugu, the destructive forces of a European cultural mindset, if that logic is still holding authority in our own minds and our own communities. Our ancestors, I believe, are calling us to the crossroads of this grief that we are experiencing. In the practice of Ifa, the Yoruba offering is presented to SU first en route to going to Olodumare. It's in the crossroads that virtue and identity is determined in our lives. And so here we fulfill the biblical mandate to present ourselves as living sacrifices, willing to utterly be redesigned by the ancestral covenant that we made long time ago. This process, though, must be holistic. We need to be intentional about embracing intersectionality. We can no longer treat race and gender and class as unimportant constructs as we do this work, because the various experiences of harm and the processes of repair are complexly interlocked. And so our most effective approach to reparations requires us to be acutely aware of how intersections shape both the injury done to us and the remedy that's required. This National Symposium for State and Local Reparations, in tune enough to center, is an exciting workshop for remediation in my mind. We've got the capacity to reclaim our spiritual architecture that can fuel a true victory in our lives. I'm dreaming at McCormick Seminary of intentional doctor of ministry tracks and micro-credentials, Mama Iva, and curricula that will be tangible proof that a recommitment to our covenant can lead us to restoration and reconciliation. We are here today, I believe, at SU's crossroads, a threshold ready to move from the hurtful history of our ancestors to the destiny that they yet dreamed of. We have lived and are living through the definitions from the Nuremberg Tribunal and the legal definitions of genocide and crimes against humanity. But our ancestors knew that our destiny was greater than our history. I'm 100% clear that if we get serious about using our original AI, our ancestral intelligence, and listen to the messages that they're sending us even right now, if we listen, I believe that they're telling us now that their trials that they've been through can track us towards triumph right now. I'm believing that they're telling us that their victory that they went through can be victory, vinegar that they went through can be victory for us. And so, brothers and sisters, I want us to consider this as a planted seed toward our mandate for this symposium. For us to move beyond history's wounds, we've got to activate our ancestral spiritual technology to reframe the continuities of harm, not as change, but as potential fuel for our destiny of reparations. I want to end by simply sharing this as a word of encouragement. I do not play golf at all, but most of my friends do. But I heard that when golf players initially began to play golf, they played, Reverend, with a smooth ball, and the balls would not fly very far. They would end up in the rough. They would end up in traps. They flew erratically. But eventually it was noticed that as the balls got dents in them, because of going in the rough and the traps, that they began to fly further because of the dents. And so now everybody plays golf with golf balls that have nothing but dents in them, because those dents allow the air to surface over the ball and create a turbulence that allows them to go further and more accurately, because they recognize that the dents have power in them. I'm sure that somebody in the room right now can see what it is that I'm suggesting, because everybody is here at this symposium because all of us have got some real dents in our lives. We've lived our lives through the rough. We've been stuck in the trap too long, but our destiny, I want us to remember, is greater than our history. And so if we hold on just a little while longer and continue to organize and strategize and mobilize, recognizing that these dents will make us fly further, I'm suggesting that we'll go further and straighter, because one day all of us will be able to stand and say together and mean it, Pamoja tu Tushinde. Together we really will win if we do the work that the ancestors called us to do.
I didn't know we were preaching up in here, but we just did. Right, Jeff, would you please come up and take this mic? Has it been good? Okay, I'm not biased. It's been real good.
Good morning. Yeah, we got our kind of sermons this morning. My name is Jeff Trask, and I want to just add a certain perspective on what we've been talking about this morning about interfaith. And just to give you a little bit about my background, I've kind of had this dual experience in life where I grew up in a Black Baptist church, lived in predominantly black neighborhoods, but I ended up going bus to predominantly white schools. And so from the age of 5, I've been able to experience these two cultures my whole life. And what that's been able to do for me is to be able to interact with folks from both sides of the train tracks, if you will, and be able to identify certain things and be able to communicate in a way that tries to move the needle when it comes to building these relationships up that will eventually transform into actual action. And so ultimately, long story short, when I got out of college, I ended up being introduced to the idea of being a pastor at a predominantly white church called New Covenant Fellowship, where the goal and the task was to try to bring us together as one body. We talk about being one body a lot. We're actually trying to actually do that one body thing. So over the years, I've been able to kind of develop this kind of process in which how I communicate and be able to do teachings related to reparations and racial justice, and do it in a way where there's this kind of fine tightrope between being able to truly get the point across and be assertive with the point, but not have people run into the hills at the same time, right? You know, it's unfortunate that tightrope exists, but you got to deal with it so that people can hear you, can listen, and actually make things happen. So I'm going to take my time just to share one of the teachings I use that deals with the Samaritan story. And for you pastors out there, I know we used to call it the Good Samaritan story, but if you know the context, Good Samaritan didn't make any sense, so I'm going to say this is a Samaritan story. And so we know, familiar with the story, you know, you had this guy who was robbed, and he's a victim, and he's sitting there naked on the side of the road, right? And this priest walks by, sees what's going on, sees this person in desperate need, but continues on his way, right? And then the next person, the Levite, priest of the priest, sees the person naked on the side of the road, goes by their way. And then, of course, the Samaritan sees this person and does something about it, takes the person, takes him to the hotel, get them all worked up and cleaned up and everything, and takes care of them. So what I like to do is I like to share a perspective from an African-American perspective of how I see the story. So this robber, I see this robber as being this white dominion, as was discussed earlier, this idea of white supremacy, white society being in charge. That's the robber. That's the spiritual soul of white America when it comes to this dominion, this idea that that's an antithesis of what it means to be a Christian and be one body. And so that's what the robber is. And so the first priest comes by, to me, that's like the law of the land, right? The law of the land, the Constitution, this country is built on these ideals of liberty and pursuit of justice and all these things that we keep told about, equality and all these kind of things. But we know there's a contradiction there. You know, I find it pretty fascinating how much of a contradiction these founding fathers that literally fought against the British for freedom and liberty can at the same exact time be slave owners and be able to hold people in bondage at the same time. And it's even amplified when you think about it being a faith thing on top of that, right? And so this first priest is like the law of the land that's supposed to protect us. It's supposed to deal with this white dominion, supposed to make things equal, but it ended up walking on by, right? Our Constitution that talked about black people being 3/5 of a person, for example. We can trace the history of our government and things in our government that has led to inequality as opposed to equality, right? And so, and again, and not that every law is bad, because it wasn't like the Bible said this priest was an evil person, and you know, but on that day, they failed to do their job, right? And so when it comes to certain laws in this land, it fails to do its job of presenting that equality and equity. The next person that walks by is the Levite, priest of the priests. And I consider this the history of the church. You know, we talked about the history of the church from back then to the continuity now. You know, again, I'm speaking to the choir, but we know about the papal bull, Dum Diversas, the Romanus Pontifex. These are two things that came from the church saying and giving permission to the King of Portugal, you have a right to enslave black people, do whatever you need to do to subjugate them if they're not Christian, right? From the church, that kind of sparked off the entire slave trade. So here's this entity that is supposed to be the essence of protection and essence of equality and things of that nature, being the actual source of the slave trade, right? And that's where it started. And so this Levite, who's a priest of the priests, that's supposed to be even more apt to protect humanity and more apt to protect equality, walking on by. And once again, the Bible didn't say that this Levite was a bad guy. It didn't say he had doing all the bad things. But on that day, it failed to do its job. And so I communicate that when it comes to churches, it failed to do its job. I mean, we can think about how can historically a person do a lynching on Saturday and sit in the church the next day be a deacon in the church on Sunday, right? We see these contradictions, right? And so my idea is to bring these things to light. So then you may say, well, Jeff, who in the world is this Samaritan? Who is this person that was able to take this robber off the road? And I really stick a craw on people, I think, when I say this, but I say that's where black folks come in, right? I think black people who have the ability to communicate and build relationship with people like Pastor Nabors talked about, has that ability to get this white dominion and fix it up and get it to where it's supposed to be in the first place. And I'll give you a quick example. You may have heard of Darrell Davis. Darrell Davis is a black jazz musician who decided one day that he wanted to find out why white people hate him so much. And so he set up a meeting with a white Grand Wizard from the KKK. And the Grand Wizard didn't know he was meeting with a black guy, but they met, and it was tense at first, but then they actually started talking, and then that talking turned into more conversations. And the next thing you know, Darrell Davis and this Klan member are going to each other's houses for dinner. And if you watch this is a TED Talk, if you don't believe me, you watch this TED Talk, there is actually a video of Darrell Davis at a Klan rally, and his friend, the Klan member, is saying at the Klan rally, I don't trust a lot of you guys out here, but I trust my friend Darrell Davis, right? At the end of the day, Darrell Davis managed to not only get that Klan member to hang up his robe, but 200 Klan members to hang up their robe by building relationship. And that's what I think this interfaith thing is about. It's about being honest, being direct, being graceful, but building these relationships so things will happen. And I'll give you an example of my church. Again, New Covenant is a predominantly white church, but when George Floyd murder took place, there was this anti-racism pact. And the church decided that we're going to sign this pact. But what it said was, you can't just say you're anti-racist, you have to do something about it. Right? So they asked me to head their church's reparations group, and we ended up educating the church. We spent Sunday mornings, once a month, talking about how the biblical mandate for racial justice and for reparations, and that is not a political thing, polarizing thing, it is a spiritual thing, it's a justice thing, right? And we educated on the church about the education system, housing, mass incarceration, land ownership, whole 9 yards, spent plenty of time doing this stuff. Ultimately, what they came down to, they wanted to make it personal. So they decided to do reparations for any African-American folks who came to the church. Again, predominantly white church, so it wasn't a whole lot of us, right? But for any African-Americans that came to church, their descendants got a education fund started for them at $1,000 to start off with, and $500 a year after that. My 2 grandchildren, for example, are benefactors of that program, right? And they're doing it for 32 kids, and it's not even a big church, right? So 32 kids had these education programs started for them because they're making reparations real and pertinent to them. That's what relationship can get you on an interfaith scale. And so I go and I talk to various types of churches, Lutheran, Mennonite, Baha'i. I talk to various groups. I go to national conferences that have predominantly white audiences, and I share these important factors. I give them that history because we take for granted in this room how much people don't know, right? And when I shared little nuggets of information, like how the Statue of Liberty had nothing to do with immigration, people are shocked, right? And so we cannot take for granted how much people don't know. So we need to share that information. We need to educate people and not take for granted what they don't know, and do it again in a graceful, meaningful way. From that information, I also challenge people to how they think. The Bible says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And we often let the world dictate how we think about things, as opposed to letting Christ let us dictate how we think about things. Christ says we're one body. The Bible says that we're one body. What does that mean? It means that if one body is hurting, then the whole body has to pay attention to that. And so I talk to my brothers and sisters and say, hey, this is part of the body that is hurting. We can't just simply talk about reconciliation and not do anything and ignore that. We actually have to do something about it, right? And so I try to share these kind of things with these audiences so that people understand that it is a transformative thing to actually build relationships and to actually make things happen. I could go on and on and on, but I want to just kind of express the importance of being informative. And also, it's not just the past, it's the present. Robert Jones wrote a book called White Too Long. And I don't know if you heard of it, but basically it's from a white Southern Baptist pastor, evangelical pastor. And he basically did a survey, and he looked at Catholics, Protestants who were more like Methodists, Lutheran Protestants. He also looked at evangelical Christians, and he looked at atheists. He looked at these 4 different groups, and he measured the level of racism among these 4 groups. Do I have to give you a guess to figure out what group was least racist? The atheists, right? The evangelical Christians were recorded as the most racist, right? And this book just came out a few years ago. It's not that old. It's not ancient history. So we're dealing with the past and the present of this dichotomous type of situation where the church is supposed to be the beacon of being one body and being united and about justice and equity, and ends up not being that a lot of times. And I'm not saying that the church doesn't do a lot of wonderful things. Just like I said, the Levite wasn't a bad guy every day, but in some cases they fell short. We got to hold the church accountable to not fall short any longer. So that'll be what I had.
And obviously so much has been shared this morning, and the symmetry between things that have been shared has been profound, almost as if folks worked collaborative. I mean, it's been a collaborative effort to get us to this point, but the nature of how the synergy worked from each presentation almost seems as though folks were in a room together really planning. So I think that's a great sign. So what we want to do, I'll offer an initial question, but this time obviously is set aside based on what you heard. We definitely want to hear from you to pose some questions and some insights to each one of our esteemed panelists that have presented so phenomenally on today. So I want to start, as I thought it was phenomenal in terms of Dr. Nabors providing us with the Evanstonian historical perspective, Dr. Carruthers helping frame the theo-sociological analysis in its connection with genomics, human identity, and AI, and then Dr. Rice providing us with ways to think about ancestral knowledge, the transmutation and the transmission of that, and how can that inform us currently, and then Reverend Jeff providing us with some very concrete, specific, and practical ways in which working on the local level in terms of a pastor, but also a local ecclesial leader, what that looks like in terms of change and transformation. So I want to ask, just as an initial question, and again, we want to hear from you. Hopefully you have your questions prepared, your insights and comments. Dr. Nabors, I want to start with you in light of many who are coming maybe to Evanston for the first time, becoming aware of the work that Evanston is doing. Can you say a little something, as you alluded to and spoke to what that work has looked like, My question would be, what were some of the maybe moments of contention and the challenges in the process of making the conversation in terms of a citywide initiative? Where were some of the challenges that occurred in that process over the course of time? Isn't it? He had
Okay, all right, can you hear me now? Yeah, I think that's a great question, and because we always talk about the fluff and the good stuff. So talking about the challenges is important, and it keeps it very real. So I think that one of our challenges initially was the fact that we really didn't know each other. I talked about the importance of building relationships and all of that. So there were just a few relationships that had been built up, but by the time reparations came around in 2019, we saw the necessity for creating greater relationships. And the challenge in doing that was people being accustomed to their own ritual and to their own routine and their own tradition. And so we had to figure out, how can we stop that? How can we allow or invite white clergy to come to some of the African American clergy meetings, and how can we make sure that black clergy feel comfortable coming to some of the interfaith meetings? So that was part of the challenge, and what we did is we created these wonderful social trips and events. We also created something called Solidarity Circle Race Talks, and we were able to get a grant from Northwestern University to do a series of race talks over a period of about a year, and that involved about 12 of these congregations. And we trained African American facilitators to be responsible for those. And that was some of the rough stuff. You know, Jeff talked about trying to make sure that you are having the ability to walk a balanced framework instead of having people run away to the hills. So when you have 10 people who are sitting around a table, 5 white and 5 black, talking about racism and the effects of racism, that can be a real challenge. And that's what we did. We got through that. One of the positives in terms of the outcome of that was we were only going to have one race talk around 2 hours for these different groups, and the groups were so focused on trying to accomplish something that they decided to have 3 conversations. And those 3 conversations ended up being over 1 month. So that was 6 hours of conversation instead of just 2. So we got to know each other a lot better. So those were some of the challenges that we faced.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Nabors. So now let's open it up for response, engagement, questions based on what you've heard so far, or either what you just heard. Anybody from the floor this morning? Don't everybody jump at once, please. And we can move a mic, I'm sure. Sis, right? Oh, okay. There's one in the back.
Hi, Lowell Taylor from Arkansas. I think my question for the is, as we think about interfaith work or engaging white churches, whether that's at the local level, like, or upstream of that, like a denomination, have we seen in your local context or nationally any opportunity to engage a particular denomination of like a predominantly white? Does that question make?
Could everybody hear this question? I know the mic was going in and out a little bit. Okay, he shared, tell me if I'm paraphrasing correctly, has there been any effort to connect with a white denomination to have the conversation around reparations, or has there been any white denomination that has been open to embracing the idea of reparations and getting involved in the work?
So we're going to pass that over to Mama Ivy, but I want to say that I know Lowell from Fayetteville, Arkansas, so he's doing a major work in Fayetteville, Arkansas, believe it or not, on reparations, and had Robin Simmons and I down a few months ago. So I want to say it's just amazing. If you had asked me whether or not reparations would work in Fayetteville, Arkansas, not Little Rock, Fayetteville, I would have said, what are we coming down here for? But he's doing a great work there. So I wanted to say that before Mama Iva responds.
So I will give a little response that begins with somewhat of a biographical statement in response. My family migrated to Evanston in large part as a result of the massacre in Elaine, Arkansas in the 1919. And one of my great uncles expatriated to Brazil, so I have a whole Brazilian family. And that Brazilian family married into a Nigerian family, and so I have gone full circle in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, which is a part of my personal narrative. But when you go to Elaine, Arkansas, they still talk about give us the land back, okay? I say that to say that part of the response to your question is this act of remembrance. My introduction to the reparations movement in the international context and the global context actually grew out of my work as a member of the United Church of Christ. And Rev.Dr. Bernice Powell Jackson at the time was over the racial justice desk of the United Church of Christ. And we collectively, from a denominational perspective, did a curriculum for the denomination around reparatory justice. Reverend Bernice Powell had served as an adjutant of Bishop Tutu and therefore was greatly influenced by the Truth and Reconciliation, quote, process, but most importantly, the Free South African movement. And so there is history, there are models, and most of your white denominations now do have work going on in ministry in those areas, deconstructing theology, trying to create resources for churches. But I do think your question is very, very important. How do we put together the resources to create an ecosystem that creates a real significant paradigm shift? And I just applaud you for doing the hard work in Fayetteville, of all places, the home of Walmart's country. And Tyson.
And I think Sis has a question, and then Reverend Jeff, anything else you would add to that in light of your congregational work?
Absolutely. I think a lot of this stuff happens at the local level. You really have to be, on ground zero when it comes to happening sometimes. So one of the things I
Pass him another mic.
So one of the things I experienced talking to other Mennonite congregations, both down in Champaign and also in Chicago, is that once you start that conversation, then those individual churches can actually start thinking about what it means for them. And then they can actually start coming up with plans to make it really personal for that particular church. And I'm of a belief that reparations could be as creative as it could be as many things as our creativity allows. And so when you think about what our church is doing with the education fund for our descendants of African Americans that attended our church, any church can do any type of things like that to try to be involved directly. I do know that the Presbyterian on a national level, Presbyterian Church, are doing some things. I totally blanking on the brother's name that is in charge of that, but I met with him. Jermaine, yes. So they're doing some things on the national scale there. He has a series of videos that he shares with their white congregations about restorative justice, reparations, and racial justice. And then, of course, we also know that the Jesuits, I think they're trying to dedicate about $1 billion towards reparations as well. So there are some things happening, as Dr. Carruthers is saying. So there's things that are taking place, and I think we have to make sure we leave an open mind, it being from the local and personalized level all the way up to the denominational level, what they want to do. And the work is just getting in front of folks. The work is actually making it happen, talking to folks, having conversations, building those connections, and so on and so forth.
All right, thank you.
Right. Thank you all for this panel. This is a great opportunity, especially for me. I'm fairly new to the reparations space. I've been involved in the reparations movement maybe about 6 years now, and really have learned so much from you all today. My question is, I've been doing workshops for creative communities, like artists, et cetera, organizations, philanthropic foundations that support artists as well. And one of the things I find challenging most is almost like a rejection amongst our own people of the reparations movement. And sometimes I find it very hard emotionally, spiritually, to ground myself in continuing on the conversation, although I do. But I know that y'all have seen and heard many layers of this, and I wanted to know like what tools, what sort of what tools we can use, I can use to balance myself and balance others into really getting involved in this movement, moving past the resistance of it amongst our own people.
Dr. Rice.
When Mama Iva passed me the microphone, I started thinking of what I would say. The first thing that came to my mind, though, sister, is we've got to put books in front of our people that kind of help us to reframe where we are, because we think we're in a space that we really are. And what I'm thinking is one of my favorite books by Asa Hilliard is a book that's called The Maroon Within Us. And there is an essay in that book that talks about the making of a sheepdog. And it talks about how a sheep herder, on the day that a run of puppies is born, it takes the weakest looking dog and puts it with a group of sheep. And it grows up sucking the DNA of sheep all of its life, such that a couple years later, it's faster and smarter, it's stronger, but it thinks it's a sheep. Such that if its own brother and sister comes to even look like it's going to do something to the sheep, he'll kill them. Unfortunately, while most of the people in this room, my assumption is that we're on the same page, but many of us are sheepdogs. There's a reason that the current administration and others are trying to keep us from learning our histories, so that when you begin to talk reparations, your own people will say it's an argument that should no longer be made. And so the sort of Saturday schools that our ancestors were wise enough to create, where real teaching took place, what we need to put in front of our people is the teaching, because in my mind, the Bible says the two greatest commandments that all of the commandments hang on. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, yes. But the second one says, love your neighbor as yourself. Someplace we've got to be doing the as yourself work. If the as yourself work is not going to be done, then, that's kind of how you land where you are.
Another thing I would mention too, while I actually absolutely recognize the frustration and difficulties, there's a predominantly white pastoral group that I've been trying to get a reparations presentation for, that I've gotten resistance, even though the same group had someone who spoke and talked negatively about Black Lives Matter. So they clearly have that space to have folks talking, but when it came to reparations, I'm working with. But what I will say is that to embrace it, and what I mean by that is the same person who's in charge of the speaking, I decided to meet with him directly and have a conversation with him directly and see what are his fears about reparations? What are the hangups? What are you concerned about? And you start digging into that, all of a sudden things just start to move along, where now we have a relationship, now we're forming that connection, and I'll probably be presenting early next year on reparations. So if you can embrace those negative kind of those pushbacks, a lot of times once you kind of dig in, you can actually move that needle. I talk on conservative radio stations, or I get these phone calls saying all kind of stuff, and instead of again being angry and mad about it, which part of me is right, but what I'm expressing though is I'm welcoming those questions, because what that means is that we are having a conversation about it that if I wasn't there would never happen, right? And so that person that's calling in is all representing how many other people with the same kind of thoughts. So now I get to address them and all those other people with that information, and then share information, the history, the reason why they might be inaccurate what they're saying. All that gets out there now. So as difficult as it is, which I've seen that in many different contexts, if you can embrace it as much as you can, you'll find that you can actually move that needle.
Hi, I wanted to know, and I'm sorry I just got here, I just flew in from Massachusetts, so, and we were delayed because of the snowstorm. I had a question because I helped start an interfaith group around reparations. There, the core of it started from the George Floyd incident, and it's, I would say, driven mostly by Jewish people, and then black people were brought along, the black people in our community, and I just moved to the community, so about 5 years ago. I'm really curious about what do you do when you come up against the politics of, for instance, we found that many of the deeds had originally in our, because I'm from a white city, and the population of black people is about 2 to 3%. Many of the deeds originally did not allow for black people to even buy land in that city. So there's a historical context, particularly in the North, around this, and I'm just curious. I'm really interested in, they want to do like very symbolic things like change signs and name a thoroughfare, which to me seems ridiculous in a lot of ways, but I understand that that's where they're coming from. And I just wondered, what are the conversations that you're having? Because I really want to look at something like land back, like literally like the Native Americans. Like, how do we have a conversation about actually staking land for black people in this country, the land that was supposed to be originally given to us? But to even, there's like no space for that kind of conversation. How are you talking to people about serious reparations, not just cosmetic, I guess is the word?
So I'll be the first to try to respond to that, and really in the context of what happened in Evanston. So our reparations became political from the very beginning because there was an elected official that brought the idea to city council. So I think that what happened in those initial conversations in a northern city like Evanston with a university, a major university, that unfortunately paid a $75 million settlement to the Trump administration the other day to get back $800 million that should have never left them in the first place, but that's another issue. So being in Evanston, I think that what happened in those initial conversations was the conversation about reparations was, it's a good idea. Everybody thinks reparations is a good idea, but we can't do it. We're naming streets for some of the black people who live in Evanston. We're giving honorary names and that sort of thing, but the persistency of one local person named Robin Rue Simmons continued to keep the conversation alive. And Robin was not only important on the city council, but she was also important in the black community that she represented, which was the 5th Ward. And she then reached out to various folks in the community that began to catch on reparations is important. And that would include a judge, that would include other people on the city council, that would include the NAACP. All of them began to lift up that conversation so that even though it began politically and folks were like, oh, it's just a nice thing, everybody agrees, but we don't have the money, we'll never be able to get it done, it became an issue that would not go away. And that's what has to happen, I think, in your community as well. How can you and others that believe in reparations gather together a strong enough coalition and network to say this conversation is not going to go away? It is urgent and it is needed. And we can't have surface reparations. It has to be reparations where people are going to repair the damage that has been done due to racism. And that's always a monetary issue in our community. So I would say don't despair. And don't give up. Keep it going and don't stop. And recognize, and we don't say this enough, that there were a lot of naysayers as well. There were a lot of folks in the Evanston community and in the black Evanston community that fought tooth and nail against reparations in Evanston. They did. And they were vocal and they were public. and they were mean, and they were thrusting that meanness at Robin like you would not believe. And then some of it came my way. I think I was able to deflect most of it because I'm a preacher, and some folks are a little nervous about talking about preachers publicly. Amen. They do it privately. Amen. But you have to handle that. You have to be able to withstand all of that and to keep your eye on the prize. But that's a really great question.
I would also add that you have to document the harm, and that becomes very, very important. I recently spoke to a retired global human rights attorney, who was one of the co-founders of the television show that solved the unsolved deaths, murders, etc. And her point was the hardest task to bring your case to the international courts is based on whether you can get the evidence. And so the work of getting the evidence after the fact can make all the difference in the world in terms of your success or your failure. So if you have any opportunity to document the harm, then you are in a much stronger position to address, and it sounds like you do, the demand for reparations. And one of the things we discussed before you were able to be here was the difference between the biblical narrative of Zacchaeus, which is more like the Evanston model, and versus Onesimus. And so it is important that we engage in collecting the memories, the collective memory, the oral tradition of the communities in which we live. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Damien.
Yeah, well, Viola got a question.
My question, I speak out loud, is that 36 years ago, John Conyers introduced H.R. 40. It just got passed this year. How long is not long?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Viola. And I know we are moving towards lunch, so we just want to offer just a few words in light of everything that has been shared. I just want to try to put a footnote, if we can, on what has been shared. And my task is to say a little bit about hermeneutics and praxis, or interpretation and implementation. And I think so much of what has been said is connected to interpretive frameworks that ultimately lead to action and or non-action. So I just want to offer a few words, I think, that continue to speak to when we think about interfaith dialogue, when we think about the significance of sacred text, and when we think about narratives that have shaped us and are shaping us. What does that mean for this conversation and centering repair, and also dealing with harm? So allow me to start with this quote. Every attempt to articulate the nation's glory serves only to dramatize its shame. A simple surface diagnosis of the system reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology which emanates from a false theology. A person's attitude towards others reflects the nature of that person's ultimate values, end quote. That, of course, is from William Augustus Jones' book entitled God in the Ghetto. This, of course, this quote by Jones speaks to interpretation, access, and dignity. Jones' statement speaks to what Eddie Glaude in Democracy in Black now identifies as the value gap. Glaude's position is that we are very much aware of the education gap. We are very much aware of the wealth gap, and many even talk about the confidence gap. But the value gap, of course, deals with whose life is of value and whose life is not. So much of the conversation around the need for repair based on harm has a whole lot to do with how people interpret who's human and who's not, who's deserving and who's not. We know that the conversation about harm and repair has always been about whose lived experiences and life deserves acknowledgement, assistance, support, restitution, and care. It is greatly based on the pieces that Jones lays out, asserting that if persons aren't seen as made in the image of God, either because the God has become money, power, control, maleness, or whiteness, or the version of God or the divine is seen cloaked in American exceptionalism and evangelical exclusionism in ways that limit how the divine is seen and understood, while dehumanizing those who don't ascribe to or meet the aforementioned criteria. Either way, those interpretive frameworks lead to toxic treatment and the justification of war, hate, and marginalization done in the name of some deity or some divine cause. Jones' frame of a false theology connected to a faulty anthropology, revealing a sick sociology, is all about the personal, private, and public square. It is about the history of narratives that demonize and unapologetically deny humanity and then justify the arrangements of socio-economic conditions to further support a toxic top-down theology, which has oftentimes been supported and promoted by the church in certain regards and those who claim to be faithful witnesses. Therefore, when we think about the whole notion of interpretation, because for me, so much of everything that we see now, right, is still based on a theology, based on how people understand the divine, the language that's used to describe the divine, and the ways in which folks either determine if people are considered divine, and then how resources are arranged to the benefit of those who are viewed themselves as God and those who are not viewed as holy and loving. So then what does that mean for how we continue interfaith dialogue? What does that mean for how we think about repair, and how does it help us see and speak truthfully, and thus how does it also help us continue to serve faithfully? Allow me to offer these few questions, and then maybe hopefully during lunch and then after lunch we can have conversations around these and other questions that will be raised. So I think one of the initial questions when we think about interpretive frameworks is, of course, how do we understand the narratives that have shaped us and the narratives that are shaping us? What's the process of examining the nature of those narratives? Number two is, whose voices have been elevated and what voices might need to be considered for elevation regarding harm and repair, as you said, Reverend Nabors. And then thirdly, what truths have we been afraid to tell? And what truths may need to be told afresh with more information, clarity, and boldness? And it is clear when we speak of repair, we are not raising a new question in the immoral imagination. We are engaging in one of humanity's oldest spiritual disciplines, truth-seeking as well as truth-telling. And thus I submit that to interpret justly or to interpret rightly is to, one, look at history without anesthesia, two, to listen without filtering out the uncomfortable, and three, to tell the truth not as accusation but as liberation. Because part of why I even asked you that question, Reverend Nabors, and part of the conversation, because just naming things obviously causes folks to get up and walk out the room, right? Because the whole notion of internalizing it and looking at it as accusation over and against investigative inquiry around the facts that have shaped our current reality, and if we don't explore, how do we ultimately move towards a future that is a replication of the past? So we are encouraged to read our sacred text with the same clarity. And when I say sacred text, we of course gather in an interfaith space where that sacred text looks different for everybody. But the sacred text canon is not just maybe the Torah, not just the Bible, not just the Quran, not just the Bhagavad Gita, but the sacred text. One of my sacred texts is the souls of black folks. That's a sacred text. Another sacred text is Womanist Ethics, the Cultural Production of Evil by Emily Towns. That's a sacred text. So how we read our sacred texts with clarity and read them in community, I think, becomes critical. And then when we talk about from a Christian context, it causes us to consider that the prophets are not just mere poets, but they are God's megaphones for the economically dispossessed, right? Jesus is not simply a healer. I'm just talking about interpretation that leads to different implementation. He is a disruptor of unjust systems, a champion of those pushed to the margins, or as I like to refer to him, he's a holy healer from the hood who offers free health care to the most vulnerable. So when we think about the mandate of what repair looks like and him having a reparatory agenda, when you interpret Matthew chapter 10, him then disseminating power over to the disciples, then giving them a mandate for reparations. As you go, heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons, and cleanse lepers. So way before you had the Affordable Care Act, that would sound like the Anointed Care Act, because Jesus is empowering disciples to engage in repairing those who've been harmed by a Roman system, and then giving them power and authority to do so, to engage in, because I would surmise that leprosy might be a pre-existing condition. I'm not a medical professional. I surmise that death just might be a pre-existing condition. I surmise that leprosy may be a pre-existing condition. And of course, Jesus gives them the mandate and says to them, as you have received freely, you give freely. So that would suggest whether they had an HMO or PPO, it didn't matter if they had any insurance, if they wanted to be healed, there was an opportunity for repair to take place. So the notion of interpretation means we look at something like the Exodus narrative, whereas on Monday, right, 70 years ago, Rosa Parks sat down as we commemorate the Montgomery bus boycott, Claudette Colvin doing it in March of '55, but understanding that nonviolent civil disobedience didn't start with Rosa, didn't start with Claudette Colvin, but I think it started with Shifra and Puah in the book of Exodus. The first time you get nonviolent direct action organizing and civil disobedience are when those sisters make a decision that they are not going to acquiesce to empire and engage in the act of genocide to those brown babies when they know that evil is not deserving of respect. So when the question is asked, their response is, well, they had the babies too quick before we get there. So we're not able to what? We're not going to comply with empire. It means considering what happens in the book of Daniel, where there is the immediate withdrawal from the intoxication of taking first the food of empire. They already get renamed in Daniel chapter 1. But the whole notion of even getting to a Daniel fast, it's about contextualizing why you even have a Daniel fast. The contextualization is not just for the spiritual enlightenment. It is a direct refusal to take the food of empire. And then what does Daniel say? Come back and holler at us in 7 days. We're going to look better, we're going to be stronger, and we're going to think clearer. But what you have all in the book of Daniel is what? Consistent moral dissent, an unwillingness to engage empire to the degree where their lives are threatened, where they are put in a furnace. Thus, I contend that right interpretation and or a faithful hermeneutic demands what? That we center, right, the histories and stories of pain and oppression, that we honor those stories, and that we refuse to spiritualize suffering. Understanding that justice begins where honest interpretation refuses to lie. And I know that that oftentimes is where the challenge is because we have different interpretive frameworks, a bottom-up hermeneutic versus a toxic top-down hermeneutic, because what we are navigating through right now is a toxic theology that has where white men value themselves as the divine, and they are making decisions in accordance with what they believe is what the protection of their progeny as they are dealing with what? Genetic annihilation. Secondly, it is not just this call, as we see truthfully and speak truthfully and serve faithfully, of course, is now the call to kind of act courageously. And obviously your presence here this morning speaks to the ways in which you've already been engaged in acting courageously, and what does it mean to be refueled and replenished gathering in this space. For we know, as has already been said, that interpretation alone will not heal the nation. We cannot admire justice from a distance, and of course, we can't just sermonize about healing without obviously putting our hands to the work of repair. Praxis is when belief becomes what? An embodied reality based on that interpretive framework. When conviction becomes commitment, and when ministry becomes a movement as a result of a changed perspective, it then changes proclamation, it changes proximity, and it changes presence, or the ways in which we show up. With new eyes, a changed mind, and an open spirit combined with a new disposition for the engagement of the work that needs to be done. We know to do the work of repair, right, involves the embodiment of a faith-filled witness. It is beyond, as Sister said, it's got to be beyond symbolism, beyond the performative, or beyond sentimentality, but obviously making its way to more material, moral, measurable, and tangible outcomes that can be felt by those who've experienced the harm. It demands the redistribution, of course, of resources, the restructuring of systems, and the rebalancing of power. A call for restoration beyond just rhetoric. And then, lastly, it reminds us clearly, right, that faith without works is not faith. Compassion without change is not compassion. And justice without material repair, beyond performative, beyond sentimentality, beyond rhetoric, is not justice. And as been said before, this work is more marathonish. This work is long range work. This work is rolling up sleeves, deep immersion, deep involvement, sitting in our discomfort, uncomfortability, but believing that that time being spent together is worth what will be look forward to on the outcome. And I close with this. As I was even thinking about the notion of reparations, obviously I'm a child of hip-hop culture, a fan of the culture, also remaining a contemplative critic of the culture. But one version of, I think, repair that was happening within the hip-hop community was what took place before Aramis Ashkadum was violently gunned down in Crenshaw, California. And those who don't know Aramis Ashkadum, that he went by the name of Nipsey Hussle. There's a great book that's been written by Rob Kenner called The Marathon Continues, The Life and Time of Nipsey Hussle, and he talks about Nipsey's journey. But those who may not know, what Nipsey was involved in and engaged in was repairing the harm that he had produced as a result of being a rolling Crip gang member. So Nipsey coming to the point of recognizing, how have I contributed to the harm in my community? And as a result of going to Eritrea when he was 18, turning to 19, what that did to change his interpretation, which then led him to change the ways in which he acted differently, to the degree in which he ended up purchasing the strip mall where he used to sell dope out of, then put the world's first smart store in that same plaza, and then was giving folks in community job opportunities. He was connected to Vector 90, which is a co-work space. He was speaking at city council meetings as $1 billion of investment was coming to the Crenshaw corridor. He had a meeting set up on Capitol Hill to meet about opportunity zones, and he suddenly gets killed. But he was planning to not just continue to do that work in Crenshaw, to give those former gang members opportunities of gainful employment and pouring back in his community. I think that he was murdered because his plan was to go to Baltimore, was to go to Chicago, was to go to Detroit, was to go all over the country, because he had respect among GDs and vice lords and other Bloods and other Crips. He had planned to engage in a reparatory agenda across this country, and he was thus taken out of here in 2019, and I think is bigger than he just called somebody a snitch. So that is one, I think, when we talk about sacred text and looking at where repair happens, I think there are even other models of repair based upon interpretation and implementation that continue to serve us as we go forward. So thank you so much for your time. That is our session for the first half.
It's showtime.